You know what? There's got to be a secret that I'm missing. It's not a secret that you're missing. The fact of the matter is, we just don't spend enough time with God. And by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandments. By faith, Moses, when he was come to age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, by faith, Moses is going to take a stand. And you'll notice the 3 things we talked about last week. Number 1, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Number 2, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season. He had a choice. He could suffer with Israel or he could enjoy the palace. And what most people forget today, God don't want us in the palace. As Cody has sung many times before, God's vineyards are what? Empty. He wants us in the vineyard. He wants us in the vineyard. Now, I understand we have to have a job, and I understand we got to make a living. But our job is to be in the vineyard. Our job that we have is to be used by God in our life that we can serve God better by being in the vineyard God has given us. Okay? Don't ever lose sight of that. Notice, suffer affliction. Israel had it rough. He's going to have it rough. Notice the next thing in verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater than the treasures in Egypt. He would rather endure the reproach of being a Christian than to have everything in the palace. And people, you got to understand, he was in line to be in the hierarchy of Egypt, if not one day possibly to be sitting on the throne. Now, in Moses' mind, Moses, like us, he thinks better than he believes. Anybody fall in that category? Instead of Moses believing God would let him lead Israel, Moses thought it would be good if he started to lead Israel when he was 40 years old and he killed the Egyptian that was whipping the Jew. It sounds logical. It's just not very faithful. Our logic overrides our faith most of the time. And it's a bad scenario to have. Our faith needs to override our logic. But it does happen in the life of Moses. For he had respect and the recompense, the reward. He was looking at the end result. I'm looking at the reward. I'm not looking at the circumstance. What gets us in trouble is we're bad about looking at the circumstance rather than looking at the reward. And we have this problem because it's nature. We all do this. I mean, this is something we all have to work on. You know, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, well, you know what, I never have a problem with that. You know what? I always have problems with this. Okay? And anybody that gets up there and says, well, I never have problems with this, just remind them there's an altar down front. They can repent and get right with God, because Revelation 21 verse 8 said, all liars will have their part in the lake of fire. And that's the biggest lie you ever heard in your life. Oh, some days our faith is good and we can handle the obstacle. And some days the obstacle runs right over us. Yeah, it's true. Moses understood. His logic failed him. And now it's going to have to be by faith. Notice verse 27, 28, 29. Verse 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. I want to look at the thought in verse 27. That last phrase is the title, if you will, as seeing him who's invisible. Moses sees the invisible God. How was Moses able to do these things? Moses saw the invisible God. Not with eyes like you and I would see, but by faith. If you'll notice, that's the key thought once again. Verse number 27, by faith. Verse 28, through faith. Verse 29, by faith. We see faith comes to the forefront of the life of Moses. You have to understand, Moses is the man that God said, I speak to how? Face to face. He said, Moses, I know you by name. Moses had a relationship with God, and by faith, he becomes the great man of Israel. Let me give you a few thoughts as we get into he forsook Egypt in verse 27. The product of his faith. I want you to see the first time Moses fled, Moses left Egypt scared. Go to Exodus chapter number 2. Exodus number 2. Notice verse 14 and 15. And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? Now, two Jews are fighting. And Moses separates them. And Moses says, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he comes back with this response. He says, you got to understand, Moses, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? So guess what? People already knew what happened. See, Moses thought, well, I killed this Egyptian or nobody will know. What did he say in Numbers? Be sure your sin will find you out. You can try to hide it all day long, and it's going to come to the surface. That's why it's better to confess it and forsake it and be rid of it. Because if you confess it, forsake it, and get rid of it, Brother White used to always use this illustration. He said, you know what? He said, you got a man that's done something wrong, whatever, doesn't matter. Did something wrong, confessed it, forsake it, got a right with God, serving God. Sometime later, somebody comes up to him and says, well, you know what? Did you do so-and-so? Yep, but I got a right with God. I'm going and I'm doing things for God right now. What can you say to that person? The old saying, can you throw a rock at his dog? No. Why? God's forgiven him. He picked up the pieces. He's serving God. There's a future before him and God's using him. Guess what? If we look in everybody's closet, you're going to find a dead skeleton. I hate to tell you that. And sometimes skeletons fall out. It's better to deal with them and be done with them than worry about it hanging over your head the rest of your life. People, because once you confess and forsake it, it's done. What can you say to that person? Okay, you win. There's nothing I can say. But Moses doesn't confess it. Moses doesn't forsake it. He thinks, you know what? You people ought to understand, I'm here to deliver y'all. And Moses was there to deliver them, just not from Pharaoh's throne. That was the problem that he had. And Moses feared in verse 14 and said, surely this thing is known. Do you think? If people's already talking about it, how many of y'all think everybody's already known it? Okay? If you do something good, won't nobody repeat it. You do something wrong and it's the talk of the town. It's in every newspaper and every headline unless you're a Democrat. And then they'll make sure it never sees the light of day. People, it's amazing. It's amazing how fast bad news travels and how little good things are seen in light of day. But notice in verse 15 rather. And when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. Now I'm going to give you my translation on this, my thought. It's very simply this. It wasn't just the fact that Moses killed a fellow. People, he's in the inner throne. He's in that inner circle. Moses would have been the one man, because once you're in that circle, it's just like our world. If you're in the political elite status, what can you get away with? Ask Ted Kennedy. How many of y'all believe Ted Kennedy was in that car when that girl, when he DWI'd, crashed and she drowned in it, and he's guilty of at least negligent homicide? He was a senator forever and a day till he died. You try that and find out how fast you go to Angola. Why, he was in that circle. He was a Kennedy. How long did it take to finally get one of the Skakels to go to prison? Because he was a Kennedy. If you're in that inner circle, there's protection. Moses was in that inner circle. But the problem was, it wasn't the fact that Moses killed a fella, as much as it was the fact that he killed a man that was hired by the Egyptian government to persecute the Jew. That's what got him in trouble. It wasn't just the fact that he killed a man. It's the fact that he killed somebody that was persecuting the Jew. Isn't that about like it is in our world? It wasn't what he did that was wrong. It's who he did it to, because he was doing their bidding against one of their hated foes. It makes sense to me, because we live in a crooked world. It doesn't make sense to me morally, but it makes sense to me politically, because we see it on a daily basis. If you don't believe me, you go out and do half of the things people in Washington D.C.'s done, and you find out how fast you go to jail and stay in jail. But if you're in that elite circle, you can do whatever you want to. Yeah. What happened to the governor, the failed governor in the last election in Florida? Santos goes in, he goes on a drug binge, he's now in a rehab center. People, let me tell you something. You don't develop that problem overnight. He had that problem for years, but he got away with it till one day he crashed and burned. That's the sad reality. You can only hide sin so long. It comes out eventually. Moses killed a man. It wasn't the fact that he killed a man. If he'd have killed a Jew, it would have been all right. If he'd have killed a regular Egyptian, it would have been all right. It may have been all right even if he'd have killed an Egyptian guard. But he killed an Egyptian guard that was beating on a Jew. So Moses runs for his life. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. The first time we see him running, he's running scared. But the second time we see him leave Egypt, he's not running scared. The second time, you know what he's doing? He's not running as a murderer, if you will, not running as a criminal from the wrath of Pharaoh. He's leading Israel into the promised land as the committed, confirmed leader of God's people. And buddy, there ain't nobody wants to get in front of him now. Son, he done gone back into Egypt. And people, when he came back into Egypt, it got bad in a hurry. Did you read what all he did to Egypt? Every time he lifted that staff, business picked up and it was never good. He wiped out the harvest. He wiped out every crop they had. He wiped out the firstborn of the cattle. He wiped out everything. In fact, the people came to Pharaoh and said, drive them out. They've already pillaged and destroyed the land. The land of wealth is now a land of nothing. Business really picked up. He leaves triumphant. The first time he flees. The second time he leaves with his head high. and that staff in his hand,